Good evening, everybody. I'm so glad that you decided to join us today. My name is Tanner Council. I am the Grassroots Manager for Chesapeake Bay Foundation here in our Hampton Roads office in Virginia Beach. I'm actually at the Brock Center tonight, a building that has been closed since March, along with a lot of other buildings, and in our at CBF. But this is a program that we've typically done here in our big conference room down the hall. But obviously, that's impossible at this time. So we're very happy to have adapted this program to an online format. If you've never joined us before, I welcome you. I do see some familiar faces in there, and I'm glad that you all took the time to join us tonight. This is a very popular program, and the best part about this is that we can get a lot more people in the room, and you all have sort of the best seat in the house. So again, welcome. We're here to talk about specifically, we're talking about pollution. That's the name of the game at Chesapeake Bay Foundation. It's trying to reduce the pollution entering the Chesapeake Bay through the watershed into the tributaries into the bay itself. And there are many types of pollution in the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries, and we could talk about those till we're blue in the face. There's litter, which is one of the most obvious kinds of litter. There are all kinds of toxics. There's bacteria, there are PCBs, there's even pharmaceuticals, which is sort of an emerging source of pollution. But at the end of the day, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, so that's nutrients and dirt, for lack of a better term, are the three primary pollutants that are holding the bay back. That science has been telling us for decades, if we can ratchet down those three pollutants, that we can save the bay. And through decades of work and cooperation, we have seen progress in pollution reductions across the bay watershed. I should note that those three primary pollutants, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, are all entering the bay through a variety of sources. And the four big ones, the four primary sources, are stormwater runoff through our streets and cities, wastewater, air pollution, and agriculture. And although we have seen, again, we've seen a lot of progress in these pollution reductions, agriculture remains the largest of these sources. And tonight we're going to discuss one specific component of agriculture, the poultry industry, one that we, as we're going to see tonight, has been following an upward trend. So we're going to take a look at the environmental science and policy behind that specific sector. And we're teeing up tonight an advocacy ask that we'll discuss at the end of the presentation. So let's get to it. The way that we're going to do this tonight is we're going to move through three presentations by three CBF staff. We're going to move through them consecutively, and we're going to leave time for a robust Q&A at the end. So if you can see on your screen, there's a Q&A feature. And please enter your questions as you think of them. Just pop them in there. We're going to keep track of it, and we're going to try to get to every question at the end of the presentations. I think that's it. So I'm going to do some introductions of our staff that we have on the call today. So I hope that you're all settled in, you got a snack, and again, get that best seat in the house. So first up, we're going to hear from Jay Ford, who's going to sort of do the overview of the poultry industry across Bay Watershed. And Jay is our Virginia Policy and Grassroots Advisor. He works to advance the Clean Water Blueprint, which is the big interstate cooperative plan to ratchet down those three primary pollutants I mentioned by 2025 through Virginia's legislature and regulatory agencies. While he works out of the Richmond office for the General Assembly, he lives on the Eastern Shore, where he has a permaculture farm, and he works with CBF members out there to champion local water quality issues. He also mentioned that he has a very bad miniature horse. He told me that was optional, but was pivotal to who he is as a person. So if you're ever on the Eastern Shore, go check out Jay's farm. Second, we're going to hear from Dr. Beth McGee, who is going to talk to us about ammonia and some of the emerging science that's coming out of that sector. And Beth is our Director of Science and Agricultural Policy with CBF. She's been here since 2003, where she is the lead policy advisor and coordinator on regional water quality and agricultural issues and campaigns. She has a BA in biology from UVA, Wahoo Wah, and an MS in ecology from the University of Delaware, and a PhD in environmental science from the University of Maryland, making her a true, all three of those together, a true Delmarva girl. And finally, we're going to hear from Dr. Joe Wood, who's going to talk to us about what's going on right this moment with poultry, with litter specifically, and with some permitting that's happening. And he is a senior scientist here in Virginia. He works out of our Richmond office, and he works on all things water quality. So that's policy, that's restoration, that's advocacy. It's a real dynamo in the General Assembly. Joe received his PhD in nutrient dynamics and has recently been serving on the technical advisory committee regarding the reissuance of poultry permits in Virginia. So with that, I'm going to shoot us over to Mr. Jay Ford.
Hi, everybody. Really excited to talk with you all a little bit tonight. Excited to share my 5 months of COVID hair with you all as well. I'm going to offer a very brief overview of sort of poultry's economic impact here in the Commonwealth, since we're going to be talking about the VPA permit during Joe's presentation, but also growth on the Delmarva Peninsula, since some of these potential pollutants that we're going to be discussing don't really recognize state boundaries, and we're talking about how they make their way to the bay. So we are going to talk slightly about the growth in the sector, specifically on the Delmarva Peninsula. Then we're going to talk a bit about the supply chain for poultry operations, because I think people don't realize the footprint of the industry and how our agricultural sector is sort of tied into one another. And that's really important when we're looking for collaborative solutions, because any kind of action at one part really has ripple effects throughout the agricultural economy. And then finally, I want to offer a very brief history of CVF's work in this area over the last couple of years. And that will help to give a little bit of context for what both Beth and Joe are going to be talking about in terms of ammonia and the reissuance of Virginia's general abatement permit for poultry houses. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get going. Okay, here we go. So I really want to start with the economic impact. I live out on the Eastern Shore. This is something that is very obvious to me, but I've learned talking to folks in Richmond and other parts of the state that the size of the poultry industry in Virginia and Maryland is really comes as a shock to folks sometimes. And so here in Virginia, chicken broilers are our top agricultural commodity. In some cases by more than 3 times of some of the other sectors. And not only is it the top commodity, but it also really lifts up other categories like soybean and corn, as we'll see on the next slide. And so as I've already referenced, this ripple effect throughout the economy from poultry is significant. And it's one of the reasons it's so important that we are working collaboratively with our partners in the agricultural sector. I want to thank our friends at DPI, or Delmarva Poultry Industries, for pulling together this great data. They've, over the last couple of years, done an excellent job really quantifying the sector on the Delmarva Peninsula. There's a couple of things here I want to draw your attention to, and I've circled them to easily draw your attention to them. But the processed number of pounds of chicken, you see here we've got the 10-year change and the 20-year change are pretty significant. But if you look at the number of chickens, the 20-year change is only 0.4%. Over the last 10 years, it's 7%. So it's still a large increase on the Delmarva Peninsula, but the biggest change is really coming from the size and weight of the birds. And that translates into increases in both manure and ammonia, which we'll hear from Beth and Joe on in a bit. The other thing I think is worth highlighting here is the number of chicken growers. As you look at the 20-year change, they're down almost 50%. And that's significant because what that means is while the number of chickens we're raising is increasing and the weight is increasing, we're doing it in a far more consolidated fashion. And so what that means is that we have more regional consolidation. And to put it more bluntly, it means we have more manure within a single region. And the question is whether or not we're outstripping that region's ability to productively use those nutrients. And the last thing, as I've mentioned a couple of times now, is the feed ingredients for chicken are up 36% here. And that's, again, hugely important. If you look at the poultry producing regions, the economy is inextricably linked. And we're going to look at the supply chain a little more here in a second. But again, there's really a nutrient loop that exists in agricultural communities with a poultry presence. So here's another way to take a look at the growth, particularly on the Delmarva Peninsula. We see both the number of birds and the number of pounds produced have gone up. Again, this translates to the amount of manure and the amount of ammonia emissions that are being emitted in that region. So I know you're sitting at home going, I want to know how vertical integration works, and you're lucky because I have your Monday night presentation for you. So vertical integration in the poultry sector, as I've alluded to a couple of times now, is the agricultural economy in poultry producing regions really are closely linked. And so you'll see here, I've sort of starred areas where CBF has often focused our attention because of the potential for pollutants at these points. But when you're thinking about a region like Delmarva, I think if you've ever had the chance to drive through it, you see corn, you see soy, you may see chicken houses. If you understand the vertical integration model, you realize that those are all connected. And while there may be many individual small business owners, the interdependency is sort of critical. And from an environmental perspective, another way to look at this is sort of as a nutrient cycle. And so the things that we're growing out in the fields that require nitrogen and phosphorus and to some extent organic matter, which we're going to talk about briefly in a moment, that is then going into the feed mills, it's going into the birds, it's going into the processing plants, and the manure that's coming out of the grow houses will ultimately go back to a field. The vast majority of it will. And so the question becomes, is there a point at which you have so much nutrients within a particular region that you outstrip that region's ability to efficiently utilize those nutrients? And we'll talk briefly about that in a moment. I do want to point out that the Delmarva Land and Litter Challenge did take some time to look at this question. They used the phrase mass balance. And as you can see here, they were really looking specifically at the question of cropland application. I would point out that, as we're going to see from Beth's presentation, another factor to consider when we think of this nutrient cycle is what's coming out of the fan in the form of ammonia that we probably need to account for. So we're out on the field. The first thing I want to note is that poultry manure is actually a great fertilizer, and it's an important fertilizer because, unlike synthetic fertilizers, there's a lot of organic matter in poultry litter. And so that is an important additive to the soil. It helps the soil to hold on to water. It increases its water carrying capacity. It also increases microbial and fungal life. And so when used properly, the chicken litter is a wonderful amendment for the soil. I think the question we always come back to is too much of a good thing at a certain point. And so phosphorus has been a concern, and that's because when you put down manure, nitrogen, whatever your crop is, nitrogen is easily taken up. It's usually utilized pretty quickly within the field, but the plants don't need the full amount of phosphorus that is in a load of poultry manure. So after multiple years of application, you effectively end up with a remainder of phosphorus that starts to build up in the soil. And at a certain point, that becomes a potential runoff risk. And so we saw this play out in Maryland, and that eventually led to the development of a phosphorus management tool. And in layman's terms, that just means that they're better measuring the phosphorus content in the soil, but they're also deciding how much manure can be applied based on phosphorus levels as opposed to nitrogen levels moving forward. So the other thing, let me stop back here. So what to do with the poop? Here in Accomack County, for example, the state's DCR has said that they thought we had about 50,000 tons of unaccounted for manure. It's certainly problematic if we thought that was the full picture. We know that some of that manure gets transported to other counties, but as we'll hear from Joe, we don't have great record keeping right now. So we're not exactly sure where all of the manure is making its way to. And that's made it very difficult for us to account for this in the Bay model. Here, we've also developed a manure transport program in Virginia, and Accomack was recently added to it. And the purpose of that is to be able to take that excess manure and bring it out of counties that have phosphorus saturated soils, or to remove it from the Chesapeake watershed entirely. At the poultry plants themselves, they have a discharge permit, and we also monitor closely their groundwater use, and that in some of our poultry producing regions, excessive groundwater use has been a real concern, particularly in areas like the Eastern Shore where we have a sole source aquifer. But the real focus tonight is going to be on the chicken Growout house. So quickly, the poultry houses in Virginia have the vast majority fall under what's known as the VPA, or a general permit. And Joe's going to talk to you about that in more detail. We do have a few houses that fall under an individual discharge permit, or a VIPDIS permit, and that's the result of EPA administrative orders in 2010. And what those orders found is they had done visual inspections of the houses and found currents of water flowing through manure sheds, found fans that were discharging directly into ditch lines, and effectively they came back and said, you're under a general permit, and a general permit assumes that there is no direct discharge. But the EPA said, we think there is. And so they issued administrative orders back in 2010, and they directed Virginia's Department of Environmental Quality to develop individual permits for these facilities. They asked that they do so in 90 days. 7 years later, Virginia issued their first VIPDIS permits in 2018, and the CBF weighed in on these permits, and that resulted in what's known as the Accomack study. And this was one of the first times that DEQ went out and actually took water quality samples at the farms. And this is something that we've consistently asked for, something we think is important when you have this amount of nutrients out of sight. But the regulatory agency has been sort of loath to adopt wholesale. So one more quick note on this permit. A permit's only as good as the information you ask for. I know the only thing more exciting to you all than vertical integration is probably how a permit gets made, but the permits say how much pollution, or if you can pollute, and essentially put guardrails in place for an industry to operate. But if the permit doesn't ask the right questions, it really doesn't have much efficacy. And so that's why what Joe's going to talk to you about tonight is really important. You can issue a permit, but if the permit doesn't have correct testing parameters, if it doesn't direct the agency how to look at it, it may not be meaningful at all. You could permit a use, and then if you never look for anything, you'll always find them in compliance. So I hope you really pay attention during Joe's presentation. I also want to quickly touch on particulate and ammonia emissions. The important thing here is that currently what comes out of the fan is not regulated. As we'll see from Beth's presentation, the ammonia impacts to the bay are significant, and they are not measured right now, and they are also, they don't fall under the parameters of the permit. And there have been a couple of attempts over the last decade by the EPA to try and get a handle on that. At one point, they were right on the cusp of issuing guidance for reporting ammonia under CERCLA and EPCA, but in 2018, an act of Congress created an exemption for that. And back in 2013, there was a ruling that effectively said whatever came out of the fan was stormwater. And so these things have made it, put some regulatory hurdles in place for agencies that want to get their hands around what's coming out of those fans and try to account for it in our bay cleanup. Finally, as I've mentioned, we continue to monitor groundwater usage, and particularly here where we have a sole source aquifer on the eastern shore, we've been heartened by the response from industry that has committed to explore more sustainable aquifers. It's critical in areas where that's people's sole drinking source, and we are already facing impacts from saltwater intrusion. But it's something we continue to keep an eye on. I've referenced them before, but I just want to briefly give a shout out to the Delmarva Land and Litter Challenge. This is interstate work group with stakeholders from the environmental community, from the poultry industry, and from third-party organizations that are interested in one or multiple aspects here. And as I've referenced multiple times, the industry is so integrated in the communities where they come from that it's absolutely critical we work on these solutions in a collaborative fashion. So I do want to point out that the work of this group has helped facilitate a lot of important conversations, and we hope that it continues to in the future. With that, and I think we've done a recklessly fast overview of a massive industry, but I'd like to pass it over to Beth to drill down a little bit into one area.
Great. Thanks, Jay. That was great. Great intro. Thanks everyone for joining this evening to learn more about poultry. I'm going to share my screen now, hopefully successfully. Where is my presentation? Okay, I don't see it. Well, that's not good. That's up here. There it is. Okay. Are we? Are you seeing it? You're probably not seeing. Are you seeing my presentation by any chance?
Not yet, Beth.
All right. Okay. All right. That's a comparison. How about now? No.
Not yet.
Okay. Well, why isn't it? Oh, there it is. Okay. Okay.
There it is.
There it is. All right. Sorry about that. Best laid plans. So as Jay mentioned, I'm going to talk about some work we did on ammonia. We actually hired a group from NC State to work on ammonia for us to do this study. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about it and kind of build upon what Jay had presented. So what's ammonia? Ammonia is actually a nitrogen-based gas that's emitted from both poultry and livestock waste. And the way it would get into the bay, for example, is it's emitted from poultry houses. It can either deposit directly on waterways, or it can be deposited on land where a fraction would eventually be washed into waterways and eventually the bay through rainfall. And current estimates from the Chesapeake Bay program indicate that ammonia accounts for roughly 1/6 of the total nitrogen that enters the Chesapeake Bay every year. So that's sort of one reason why we care about it. As Tanner mentioned, we're focused on reducing pollution to the bay, and this is one source. So here's a little bit more information about the importance of ammonia, and this is showing you over time the total nitrogen that's deposited to the bay, and that's in green. And then you'll see in blue, that's NOx, which is largely produced from the combustion of fossil fuels. So that would be basically cars and power plants. And then you'll see ammonia is in red. And you'll see, as Clean Air Act regulations have kicked in, we've seen a really dramatic decrease in NOx emissions, but we've seen an increase in ammonia emissions over time. So that actually now ammonia is about equivalent to NOx, if not more. And this is actually showing you real monitored information by satellite. And you can see the areas in yellow and orange are what it's picking up are where we know we have animal hotspots in the region. So you see Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, sort of south central Pennsylvania, where we have a lot of livestock, a lot of poultry, a lot of eggs. The Delmarva also is kind of lit up. And then you can see Shenandoah Valley. So it's kind of showing you there actually is ammonia coming from where we know to be heavily livestock and poultry production areas. So we did a study, and as Jay mentioned, we were concerned that the industry was growing. We were concerned that ammonia isn't really captured, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. So we wanted to get a handle on just how much ammonia was being emitted from poultry on the Delmarva, and of that, how much would eventually perhaps make it into the bay. And the best way to do that is to basically do modeling. And so we, as I mentioned, we work with some scientists from NC State who are air modelers, had a lot of experience with ammonia. And we ended up using as the source information from Maryland. And the reason why we did that is because at that time, and this study was published, I guess, last year, but had been years in the making. At that time, the most reliable information we had about poultry houses and capacity, meaning how many birds are in them, was from Maryland. And so, we know Delaware and Virginia are also on the Delmarva, but we just didn't feel like we had reliable information from those states at that time. And so we focused on Maryland. We actually had geolocated facilities and as well as bird capacity at those facilities. And it ended up being about 600 poultry animal feeding operations that went into the study. So the modelers take the location of the houses, the number of birds that are in there, and they use this model, which is approved by EPA, to estimate how much is emitted based on the number of birds and how far it goes. And then from that, using the model, figure out how much is actually deposited deposited, whether it's on land or water within the modeling domain, which really included a fairly wide area. And this was actually published in the peer review literature. For those of you who care about that, I'm happy to share a link to the wonky paper, but it was eventually published. So what did we find? So you can see this is showing you where the houses are. This is the map there showing you where the houses are in Maryland and the depositions. So you can see red means higher levels of deposition, yellow less so. And one of the other questions we were interested in figuring out is how far does ammonia tend to travel? If you think about a smokestack or coming from a power plant, a really high smokestack, a lot of that NOx, nitrogen, is blown, hundreds of miles away. It has a very high transport. We were interested in sort of how far did ammonia get transported, not only how much was produced, but sort of how far was it going. So you can see the numbers here from about the 600 plus animal feeding operations, poultry in Maryland, about 34 million pounds per year of ammonia are being emitted. So that's going into the air. Of what's emitted, about 24 million pounds or so are landing either on the bay or on land or in waterways. And about 30% lands within 500 meters, so fairly close, and then about 70% within 31 miles. So it's not going as far, for example, as NOx. And one caveat, there's a few caveats, but one main caveat of our study is that we did not include the use of litter amendments. And we know that there's a fair amount of amendments that are used on the Delmarva are added to the poultry litter to reduce ammonia. Birds don't like ammonia. They're not healthy if there's a lot of ammonia in the house. And so we do know that there's a lot of operators that add ammonia or add amendments, and that would reduce our emissions. But we didn't have any reliable data to include in our study. And so we acknowledge that this could be an overestimate because some of these amendments can reduce 30, 40% of ammonia coming from a house. But we just didn't have reliable data to estimate the amount of litter that was being used and the effects what effects it would have on our results. So then the big question for us is, okay, if it lands on how much we know now from the modeling that was done, how much is emitted, how much of what is emitted lands on land and water within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And then the question is, well, actually, how much of that is actually delivered to tidal waters? And so there was a recent report that was done by the Chesapeake Bay program that indicated that roughly ammonia that is emitted in Maryland, roughly 11% of that is eventually delivered to the tidal waters of the bay. So when you do the math there, all that was emitted, we estimate somewhere about 3.8 million pounds of nitrogen that are delivered to the tidal waters from Maryland's poultry operations alone. So we know that there's houses in Virginia, houses in Delaware. And so in our minds, that is a significant amount of nitrogen that, as Jay indicated, is really largely is not regulated, may be controlled by the use of these amendments, but we don't really know how much amendments are being used. So with that, so that was a whirlwind trip through ammonia. And I think with that, that's my last slide. So I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Joe Wood, who's going to put it all into context of what he's been working on in the permitting world in Virginia. So Joe, I will stop sharing my screen.
Great, thanks, Beth. Let's see if I can now figure out how to share my screen. So you should be seeing me now. So thanks, Tanner and Beth and Jay for kind of setting this up. And what I'm going to be talking about is more discrete in the sense that it's really focusing on how we regulate poultry in Virginia and some activity that's going on right now. For the past about a year or so, I've been serving with a bunch of other people on a technical advisory committee on the reissuance of the Virginia poultry permit, which governs how we treat litter, how we manage these facilities, how we ensure they're protected in the environment. So here's kind of a brief run through of what I'm hoping to cover. First, this is kind of an echo of what Jay and Beth already said, but talk a little bit about growth, particularly in Virginia. Talk about how do we manage Virginia's poultry production currently. Go into a little bit about the issues that were discussed in that technical advisory committee and that have been debated over the last year or so, and give you our take on them, and provide what the timeline is for action. There's an opportunity coming up soon for you to voice your opinion on this, and would welcome your participation. So first, if you just take a look at animal units in Virginia, across 30 years, this is within the Bay watershed. I think Tanner shared the link to where you can look at these figures. It's pretty user-friendly and quite interesting. But you can see over about 40 years, we've been increasing fairly steadily. There's ups and downs that occur with markets and probably economic impacts, et cetera. If you look at where this production occurs, it's quite concentrated. In red here in Delaware, that's Sussex County. That's like poultry capital of the country. That's like the #1 county in the nation in many years. But if you go down to Virginia, there are 2 counties that make up half the production we typically see in Virginia. The first is Rockingham. They've been increasing slightly over the past several years. The turkeys are shown in orange down here, and broilers are shown in blue. Someone in the chat box actually asked a question about layers. Layers are included here as well. They're a very small fraction of what we have in Virginia generally. And so we've seen growth in Rockingham, but there's 700,000 animal units there, so quite significant. If you look at Accomack on the eastern shore, quite close proximity to the main stem Chesapeake Bay with its water quality issues, it's all broilers, and the growth there has been fairly rapid. If you look back in '85, we've nearly tripled since then, not quite that much. And note here, there are projections included here. These graphs are taken from the Bay Program's analysis that show, if you look at the past, 20, 30 years, what do we expect the future to look like? So there's been growth, and the growth is likely to continue, and that has environmental impacts and consequences. So chickens are here, and there's a lot of them, and they continue to be growing. So that's what I want to kind of move into is how does the state manage poultry facilities in Virginia? Well, the Virginia Pollution Abatement Permit, the VPA permit for poultry, is by far the most common mechanism of managing poultry facilities. And who needs one of these permits? So generally it covers producers with 20,000 chickens or 11,000 turkeys. There's a difference in numbers there because this is essentially based on the weight of the animal. The facility cannot produce a discharge to a waterway directly. Jay mentioned this earlier. If there is a facility where there is a discharge of pollution that's going directly to a waterway, they're required to have an individual permit, a more specific permit, a BEC's permit, if you will. And then end users, the people that receive the waste from these facilities, do have requirements that are built out in this permit as well. That's who the permit affects. Then you can ask the question, what does the permit actually ask the producers to do? And there are a number of things. One of the things we did coming into this technical advisory committee was take a look at how this permit has influenced water quality over the last 30 years. And the adoption of this permit was a really, really important thing for water quality in Chesapeake Bay watershed, and did a number of good things. So some of those things include protective storage of litter, making sure that litter is covered, it's in a location that isn't environmentally vulnerable, and that it's being stored in a way that's appropriate. Another condition is, how do you apply that litter to the land? The litter has to be applied for agriculture consistent with the nutrient management plan or some other guidance that ensures that the nutrient losses, the water quality impacts from that application are not too strong. That includes setbacks about where it can be applied, not being too close to the water. The third thing here is brokers, the people that are moving the waste around from place to place, they have to tell DEQ, they have to tell the state where they're moving this material, and provide some information about that. End users also have a requirement, but note here in bold, their requirement is only to keep the records, not to actually report them to the agency. That's generally the scope of the permit. There's a lot more included in what the permit does, but those are some of the big things. One thing the permit does not do at all to date is address ammonia emissions. And this, the science behind ammonia emissions has been around for a while, and so this has been an issue for quite some time now. So just to give you a kind of briefing on what's the debate been about throughout this technical advisory committee about, how should we move forward with this reissuance of this permit. So the first issue that we discussed quite extensively is that about end users reporting their records rather than just keeping the records. And so this is something that the state in their phase 3 watershed implementation plan for the Chesapeake Bay kind of clearly pointed out that in order to do a better job of managing litter, which as you can see is fairly concentrated in the Commonwealth, we really need to have records so that we can make sure that it's going to the right places, so that we can incentivize moving it to places where poultry litter is needed. So that they've adopted that as a strategy, and that certainly was a piece. The second point I'd say about this is that from our perspective, requiring reporting of records rather than just keeping them on the farm is something that's not a burden to the producer, especially if they're compliant. If they're currently following what they're supposed to be doing, which is keeping records about where the nutrients are applied, where the manure is applied, really all that's being asked for here is for them to send that to DEQ. That can be through the mail, that can be through a stamp. So the ask here to change from just keeping records to reporting records is a debate that we had for quite a long time. And from our perspective, it's critical that those end users are required to report this stuff to DEQ so that we have a better handle of this, so that we can manage these large volumes of waste. So this first issue that we discussed, this in the package that has gone to the State Water Control Board, which will be up for a vote sometime in the next 6 months or so, this was included. So we are thanking DEQ, thanking them for requiring reporting of this information in this regulation. The second issue that was discussed extensively was a question about whether stockpiles, piles of litter that are used on the farm getting ready to be applied, whether they should be covered or not. Currently, there is a requirement that after 14 days, a stockpile needs to be covered to protect it from rain and the losses it might have. Our partners in industry had proposed removing this, going to something different. And primarily, this was on the basis of a 2004 workshop by Greg Benford in Maryland. And there's a bunch of partners involved in this that essentially suggested that if you have these large piles and they're shaped the right way, that the tops can crust over, and that can essentially seal in the nutrients and prevent losses. And so we considered this proposal actually quite extensively and looked at the scientific literature about it. And ultimately what we came up with was that we tend to agree actually that this crusting effect can certainly prevent losses. But even in that situation, there's still a substantial level of risk by not covering a pile. You could have a fairly heavy rain event, a hurricane even come through in an unexpected fashion, and that could lead to water quality problems. A few other issues that we came up with, one is that the 2004 study that kind of put this forward has not been peer reviewed. And so there's, that is an important part of scientific rigor before moving forward. But there have been dozens of studies that essentially suggest that uncovered piles of poultry litter do lead to leaching. They do lead to runoff problems eventually. Does that happen in a 14-day period? Probably not always. It's not exactly clear when exactly that starts to happen. It's something that varies with soil type, with weather conditions, a number of different things. But ultimately, where we fell out on this, trying to be respectful of this proposal, was that it does introduce risk if these piles are not covered. And I want to say that the idea of covering one of these massive piles of poultry litter with a tarp, repeatedly over the course of a summer, it doesn't sound like a fun activity. So I can appreciate why, a producer might not want to do that. From our perspective, it is something that is eliminating some level of risks. The second thing that kind of came to bubble up throughout this that I found from studying nutrients quite fascinating, actually, is that the losses from piles that are uncovered of ammonia, of gassing off of ammonia coming from these piles, have the potential to dominate the amount of nutrients that are lost. And one of the things I did throughout this process was I worked with a guy, Sanjay Shah, down at NC State. He's a professor that works on all types of air issues related to agriculture. And essentially, we cited some of his work. We cited the study in 2004. And when you compare how much leachate or runoff comes from a pile relative to how much ammonia emissions come from an uncovered pile, the ammonia emissions just dominate. They're so much greater. And keeping the pile covered certainly helps prevent that. Once you apply it to the land, there's some questions about if those ammonia emissions are captured. But I found that fascinating from the perspective of how big of an issue ammonia from poultry litter can potentially be. So we kind of used a similar approach that Beth talked about to estimate bay deposition. And ultimately here, the conclusion was that just this idea that ammonia emissions, even from the pile that's in the field, can be greater than the leachate losses. But to close out issue number 2, the state ended up keeping things where they were. And so we were very thankful to the agency for being considerate of that. The last issue is what we've been talking about through Beth's presentation and most of the night, and that is that ammonia still has not been addressed in this permit really in any meaningful way. And the study that we worked on with NC State, I thought it was really interesting. I thought it provided a lot of context. I didn't necessarily think it was technically groundbreaking from any perspective. I mean, the idea that ammonia is a problem for water quality is something that I think has been understood quite well through the peer review literature for 20 or 30 years now. So we have decades of research suggesting that ammonia emissions are problematic and have serious implications on water quality. And the litter additives that Beth talked about can certainly help. These things are typically used to improve bird health in the houses. But as of right now, the state has no idea what is going on with litter additives. If you ask DEQ, who is using what litter additive, they don't have any information on this. And as a result of that, our ask throughout this process, the Potomac Riverkeepers Network, Philip Musagas and I have been both on this technical advisory committee, and we've both asked for the state to require reporting of litter additives. We think this is a fairly low burden to the producer to just get the information to the state about how many additives there are, so that we can start understanding what are the impacts of ammonia emissions from poultry, so that we can take modeling studies like the NC State study and put the real numbers in. And so from our perspective, moving forward on requiring litter additive reporting is a really critical first step to start addressing this issue that's going to be quite a substantial issue. This is a 10-year permit, and so the chance to kind of revisit this question won't come again for another decade. And if we don't even start asking what's there, how are we ever going to deal with this issue? That's kind of where we've fallen out on this. So the third issue here, this is an ask that we have of our supporters, is that the draft regulation that went to the board, it doesn't include litter additive reporting requirements. Again, we're not actually asking that users be required to use litter additives, but rather that they just let the state know when they do, so that they can help put these air emissions into context. So that's the gist of the issues that we wanted to cover tonight. I want to leave you with this timeline for action from where we've been and kind of where we're going. So first, DEQ issued a notice of intent regulatory actions about 2 years ago. We had this technical advisory committee that lasted about a year. The public comment period, which we thought would be open tonight but has not been opened yet, should be open any day now. And Tanner, I think, will be sending out an email to all of you to let you know about that, so you can voice your over the fall, DEQ will review these public comments, and then likely in December of 2020, DEQ will send this to the State Water Control Board for final approval. They will take into consideration feedback that they receive throughout this process, and anyone who submits comments can have the option to speak to the board at that time. Theoretically, this is kind of all new with COVID. Who knows where we'll be? But I think there likely will be some type of web-based option to address the board and offer your opinion. So again, CBF's message is thanks for the reporting requirements. Thanks for making those requirements included in this package. Thanks for maintaining the cover for stockpiles. And please start requiring reporting of these litter additives, which could be incredibly helpful for our understanding of the impact of poultry facilities. And with that, I think we're ready to kind of start to move into a question and answer session. Maybe I'll kick it to you, to Tanner, to say a few words first.
Thank you so much, Joe. And I think that Jay said it well. We kind of recklessly covered what is a really huge industry and a complex issue. I've been dropping some links into the chat feature that you all can see. You may want to click on those and pull them up so you can look at them later after this presentation. But we do have some great questions here. I'm going to try to get to all of them. So I would ask the speakers to let's try to get through as many as we can. So let's consider this a little bit of a lightning round. We'll do a softball. Jay, just to clarify, Joe, you said that the broilers in Virginia, is the egg industry separate? You said the layers. I just want to, because the word layers has a homonym, layers are referred to as the egg-laying birds, correct? And that's totally separate from the broilers. We touched on this a little bit. Do you have comparable figures for poultry in the Shenandoah Valley? I think that's to Joe.
Yeah, so the easiest way to get to that, I think, is that tool you cited. You can select a county by county basis for any state in the Bay watershed, as long as the county's in the Bay watershed, and it will give you animal units by breakdown of broilers, layers, turkeys, livestock as well.
Okay. I'm not sure who wants to take this one. Anonymous attendee says, you connected some dots for me that corn and soy locally are inputs to poultry production. Is there any data to say what % of Delmarva corn and soy production is serving as inputs to poultry versus other users?
Sorry, Beth, go ahead.
No, all I was going to say is I know that they import feed for the poultry industry, so it's got to be a lot. But Jay, if you have a better answer than that, so we're importing feed. We can't make enough, on the Delmarva.
I was going to give the same answer. It is by far the vast majority of feed of row crops on the Delmarva Peninsula, and yeah, we are importing. So it is outstripping our ability to produce currently.
Here's another one, Lisa, who says she's on the eastern panhandle of West Virginia. Are there any special notes for her in that part of the watershed? What % of pollution is sourced there? Now, I'm not sure which pollutant she's referring to, but where would she be able to find numbers for West Virginia?
I think that link that that you shared, Joe, that you came up with, that would provide some insight to that question, wouldn't it?
Yep. Yeah, like I said, any state across the watershed, as long as it's in the Bay watershed.
I'm going to drop that link again because it seems to be that there's a lot of information there. So here it is for a third time. Okay. Here is a question from Sue Maistel. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. How accurate is the Environmental Integrity Project report that projected more than 200 tons of excess phosphorus are being applied to Accomack County croplands every year? Jay?
You know, we have not taken the time to do an in-depth review of their work. I will just say that, as I referenced earlier, Maryland had to take steps to move to a phosphorus management tool. Virginia, in our nutrient management planning, we already accounted for phosphorus. So we were, I would say, I guess that would be my full answer. We already account for phosphorus in our nutrient management planning. So I don't know if I could speak to the 200,000 number, but we do account for that when people are applying manure on the fields.
Okay, thank you. How about this one from Barbara Walsh? Good question. What chemical and microbial analysis of litter is required before it is applied to land? I would say, if any.
Wouldn't nutrients be required? I mean, if they're farmers following a nutrient management plan, they're going to need to know the nutrients that are in the litter. But beyond that, I don't think there are any requirements. Joe or Jay, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would say for the application, there's a number of ways to kind of guide the farmer to applying the litter. I think there's a standard rate of application you can use at a certain time of year. If you do take samples, I know they run nutrients. I'm not sure what else they run. They're probably a couple of different things.
Yeah, for the nutrient management plans and qualification for our litter transport program, the litter must have been analyzed within the previous 3 years to determine nutrient content and final application rates. And, Joe referenced this idea of figuring out where the manure is going to land and tracking end users. And some of the gray area there is that when we go through a broker, someone that's oftentimes utilizing the transport program, we know that is undergoing all of the rigor because it has to be documented. But when we're doing sort of these third-party transfers that don't go through an official broker, it's harder for us to tell if the nutrient, if the manure has been analyzed. And so again, this really comes down to good record keeping, and which is why we urge you to weigh in with DEQ.
I've got a good one here from Scott Kelly. I think Joe, you sort of alluded to this, but Scott asks, has CBF calculated the cost of covering litter? And if so, what might this look like for a small family farm with a few hundred acres? Farmers are struggling, so it's critical that our solutions do not introduce new problems. How might conservation organizations like ours help farmers do the right thing while still being able to pay the bills and support their families?
Yeah, no, I definitely haven't calculated a cost associated with covering of a pile, and can appreciate that it is a challenge. I guess from my perspective, this permit needs to be protective of water quality as well, and so the question of cost is certainly important, but I think that covering as an approach is probably fairly cost effective, and either way it's important to protect water quality. I think it would be quite difficult actually to probably estimate the cost, and actually that didn't come up in the TAC. I don't remember seeing estimates about that, but would be interested in if there's anything out there actually.
I would just quickly add that Accomack County, where we had the significant uptick in new houses over the last 5 to 6 years. Every new operation has a poultry shed. The idea of having to cover with a tarp is really for operations that are older, that may be coming up for reissuance of a permit. But most of the new operations do build on-site manure sheds, and there are both low interest loans and some cost share to build those. And on the flip side, I would point out that covering your manure makes your products more valuable. As Joe pointed out, the ammonia loss is pretty significant. And so a lot of farmers have realized it's less headaches to just go ahead and put that in at the beginning. But we can follow up with more specifics on what those cost share and loan programs are if they're interested.
Here's another question. Jay, this might go back to you, but I think it's good to reinforce. So chicken processing, this is from an anonymous attendee. So chicken processing in Delmarva has increased in recent years. Any idea of market or industry trends? Is there evidence suggesting this upward trend will continue? Or what is the forecast of poultry-related imports to the Bay in the future?
Yeah, anything I say would just be a stab in the dark. I mean, I think it's clear people like chicken. It's been the fastest growing meat sector. You never really know what's going to happen year to year, but in terms of efficiency, the poultry industry feed conversion ratio is more effective than other sectors, and that's one of the other reasons it's appealing from sort of an economic standpoint. So it has some things going for it, but you never know what the market's tastes are going to do in the future.
Here's an interesting one from Barbara Walsh. What besides chicken droppings is in litter? For example, bedding, waste, food, feathers, miticides, antibiotics, or other veterinary pharmaceuticals, agricultural herbicides from bedding and feed, etc. What else are we finding in the litter?
So I did some work a while ago, and the answer is a lot of that. I mean, if they're using antibiotics, then we were detecting that in litter. We were detecting trace metals in litter. If they're using feed additives or litter additives, you can detect that. We tried to look at whether these were making their way into the environment, and did find some evidence that antibiotics were perhaps leaching off fields, but no smoking guns. But the answer is yes, there is lots of other stuff other than just the litter. It's whatever the birds are fed and ends up passing through their bodies.
Let's see, we've got one more, time for one more. Here is another one from Sue. I think this is a good one. Do the draft regulations address the problem that only licensed poultry waste brokers have to report transport rather than anyone who transports poultry manure?
I was just reading the question and it disappeared on me.
Oh, it's in the answered section now, Joe. In the very bottom of the answered section.
I think so. I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but the reporting has been expanded. The requirements as to keeping them, as opposed to just keeping records. Those records are intended to be reported to the agency now. So I think that issue has been addressed through the current changes that are included in the package.
Yes. So just to put a finer point, yes. This, by requiring the poultry house to keep the record, you assure that all manure is accounted for, as opposed to current operating procedures where the broker who may be moving manure would keep a record, but if someone took it who was not necessarily a licensed broker, that would not be tracked. So by putting it into the permit for the house, you assure that you capture all transfers.
I'm actually going to try to squeeze in this last one from Scott again. The question is, who are the end users and what would be the threshold for reporting under your proposal? It would seem like there's a potential untapped market for consumers, I'm thinking small gardeners, to purchase chicken litter as fertilizer. Has the poultry industry considered this opportunity, and what does CVF propose as a minimum volume to avoid inadvertently harming this market opportunity? Great question.
Yeah, so like whether you're required to report, I think depends on how much you're receiving. I think that there's a amount of litter transfer that kicks that into place. The idea whether there could be poultry litter marketed to homeowners, I mean, I think that's really interesting. I think probably the main challenges are there. It's pretty expensive to move this stuff around, even in bulk. And so get it into packaging. I mean, maybe there's a market incentive to make that happen. So
there's a definitional, by transferring manure to a homeowner is difficult. Purdue has done work to take manure and process it into, I believe organic compost is how it, the end product, and make that available to homeowners. So, there are folks looking at that as a secondary market. I can't speak to how successful that's been. I know it's had peaks and valleys, but they're certainly looking at ways to refine the manure to make it more easily shipped and received by homeowners.
I'll just add that, having an increased understanding of where the litter's going through reporting, from my perspective, kind of, would help shed insight to anybody that wanted to pursue that kind of idea.
To keep us on track, I'm going to have to call it there. I just want to thank everybody. We had a huge turnout for this, again, for a pretty niche issue. So thank you all for dialing in. There were a couple of questions about what can we do from here, and I just want to reiterate, we expect this public comment period for the permit. We kind of expect it to be open by now. We definitely expect it to open up any minute. We have an action alert drafted. You will get an email from me, Tanner Council, as soon as that opens up. So I would really encourage everybody to click through that action alert, but what's most effective, it's a template email. You can click through and just participate, and it takes just like 2 seconds to do that. But take something that you learned here tonight and add it to those comments. It creates your own voice as something speaking from your heart. Always weighs more than just a simple template email. So I hope that you'll look out for that. I would hope everybody goes and looks at this, that CAST tool that I dropped 3 times, because there are a lot of questions about what's going on in other parts of the watershed, and that's a great tool to use as well. So finally, I just want to thank our panelists tonight. Thank you all for staying late with us. And everybody, I will be sending you that, you'll get the action alert, and you'll get a link to watch this presentation over again as well. We'll send you the recording here in the very near future. So again, thank you everybody. Sorry for running a little bit